When Katherine Armstrong, a 48-year-old mother of three, died in her sleep one morning in February 1921, no one thought she had died other than by natural causes. Within 15 months, her husband Herbert would be arrested and tried for murdering her and the attempted murder of a business rival. It was a sensational case that garnered interest from around the world, and the accused was the only British solicitor to be executed. This is Vintage Murders and the mysterious demise of a good wife. Herbert Armstrong was born at 23 Princes Square in Plymouth on the 13th of May 1869 to a family of modest means. They later moved to Edge Hill in Liverpool. He studied at St. Catherine's College, Cambridge, gaining a degree in law and qualified as a solicitor in February 1895. He finished an MA from St. Catherine's in 1901. Initially practicing in Liverpool, later moving to Newton Abbot in Devon, he successfully applied for a vacancy in Hay-on-Wye, Breconshire, in 1906. The following year, he married Katherine Friend of West Teignmouth. The couple had two girls, Eleanor and Margaret, and a boy called Pearson. They moved into an imposing family home called Mayfield in the village of Cussop, a short distance from Hay, where Armstrong ran the law firm of Cheese and Armstrong. He was a hard-working man and was popular in the social community of the town. He was subsequently appointed clerk to the justices. He joined the volunteer force and rose to the rank of captain, and in 1914 he was called up in the First World War, where he eventually gained the rank of a major in the Royal Engineers Territorial Force and served in France from May to October 1918. After the war, he was usually referred to as Major Armstrong. In May 1919, Katherine Armstrong's health first began to weaken, with symptoms that the local physician, Dr. Thomas Hinks, diagnosed as a case of brachial neuritis. She appeared to recover after a short time and did not need to consult the doctor for over a year. But in August 1920, her health, both physical and mental, deteriorated again. Armstrong kept in close contact with Hinks and showed great concern for his wife, consulting relatives and friends as well. The doctor found that Mrs. Armstrong was showing signs of mental issues and came to the conclusion that it was connected in some way with her illness. Towards the end of August, she was admitted to Barnwood, a private mental institution near Gloucester. When she was admitted, she had pyrexia, vomiting, and heart murmurs. There was also partial paralysis in the hands and feet, and loss of muscle tone. She had also become completely delusional. Her condition began to improve at Barnwood, and she was discharged back home at the end of January 1921. Shortly after her return, her condition got worse again, and her health steadily deteriorated further. She had a sudden and violent attack of a stomach condition lasting several days, and she died a month after her discharge from hospital on the 22nd of February, at the age of 48. Dr. Hinks was puzzled by Mrs. Armstrong's symptoms, but nevertheless stated on the death certificate that she had died of gastritis, aggravated by heart disease and nephritis. Outwardly, Armstrong had shown nothing but deep concern for his wife, sitting at her bedside reading to her in the evenings, and leaving the office early whenever possible to be with her. It would seem that there had been problems in the marriage. It was assumed that the Armstrongs' relationship was a failure, due to the domineering attitude of Mrs. Armstrong to her husband, but the precise nature of their marriage is far from clear. She was observed as a vague and shadowy figure, who would often retreat to bed and appeared to be suffering from clinical depression. She had delusions that she had neglected her family and her husband. She became increasingly neurotic about her health, often dosing herself with all sorts of homeopathic remedies and dubious cures of all sorts. At one point, she spent a spell in a mental institution. It was generally held that Mrs. Armstrong was a singularly unpleasant woman, who regularly abused and humiliated her husband in public, and it did not go unnoticed that, though the local newspaper described Mrs. Armstrong as a popular local lady, few people attended her funeral. On the other hand, Mrs. Armstrong, whenever separated from her husband due to either to her stays in hospital or to his service in the war, is reported to express her desire for the family to be reunited at the earliest opportunity. Whatever the truth was, being on active service during the First World War had opened up new experiences and possibilities for her husband, and it was suggested that he had several affairs. He also went to dances and functions in the town and made passes at local girls. On the day of Mrs. Armstrong's death, the servants closed all the curtains as a mark of respect. The first thing that Armstrong did on returning home from the office was to open them up again. Hay-on-Wye is a relatively small town, and Oswald Martin was Armstrong's only rival solicitor in the area. They were representing opposing parties in a nearby property sale, the Villinewood estate, which could have resulted in Armstrong's client losing out in the deal, and Armstrong having to pay a large sum to Martin's client as a result. The details of the transaction remain unclear. Martin subsequently said there was a question mark concerning the title to the property. It was also suggested that money entrusted to Armstrong as a deposit on the sale was somehow gone. Martin kept mentioning the matter at completion to Armstrong, but the latter repeatedly delayed, and the transaction still remained uncompleted by the time of Armstrong's trial. In a supposed attempt to resolve the situation, he eventually invited Martin to a meeting at his home on the afternoon of the 26th of October 1921. Martin found tea laid out with cakes and buttered scones. He probably thought that Armstrong wanted to discuss completion of the property sale, but the two men merely discussed mundane everyday things, an office organisation, although Martin could, no doubt, have raised the matter himself. Armstrong spoke of being lonely after the death of his wife. During this meeting over tea, Armstrong picked up a scone and said, "Excuse fingers," as he handed it to Martin, who ate it. When he returned home, Martin became violently ill. His father-in-law, John Demise, the local chemist in Hay, had made several sales of arsenic to Armstrong, supposedly on the pretext to kill weeds in the garden, despite the fact that it was autumn and there were very few weeds in the garden and driveway of Mayfield, the Armstrongs' home. The chemist was suspicious of Martin's sudden illness, and when he told him he had been to tea at Mayfield, Davis became even more so. Meanwhile, Dr. Hinks became concerned by how similar Martin's symptoms were to those of Katherine Armstrong. Hinks, Martin and Davis discussed the situation privately between them, and Davis cautioned Martin against receiving gifts from Armstrong during the forthcoming festive season. It was subsequently discovered that a few weeks before the tea party, a box of chocolates had been anonymously sent to the Martins. Mrs. Martin's sister-in-law had eaten some and had become violently ill. Fortunately, some of the chocolates remained untouched, and when examined in detail, some were found to have a small nozzle-like hole in the base. Dr. Hinks contacted the Home Office and explained his suspicions about what had happened to Martin, later voicing suspicions about Mrs. Armstrong's death. Samples of the chocolates and a blood sample from Martin were forensically examined and found to contain quantities of arsenic. As a consequence, the Home Office now passed the case over to detectives at Scotland Yard. Meanwhile, Armstrong began to bombard Martin with further invitations to tea, for which Martin found it increasingly difficult to find excuses to avoid. The police of Scotland Yard moved swiftly but cautiously, so as not to alert Armstrong to their suspicions. They arrested him on the 31st of December 1921, and he was charged with the attempted murder of Oswald Martin. He maintained he was completely innocent. When he was arrested, the police found a packet of arsenic in his pocket and many more in his house. The police contacted the local coroner, who instructed that Mrs. Armstrong's body be exhumed, and after the autopsy by the eminent Home Office pathologist Bernard Spilsbury, her body was found to be riddled with arsenic 10 months after death, and in mid-January Armstrong was formally charged with the willful murder of his wife, and repeated what he said before, that he was absolutely innocent. The media descended en masse on the Sleepy Market town, offering £40 for photographs of Armstrong. A "Beware of the Dog" sign was put up in the garden of the family home to keep reporters at bay. The trial began on the 3rd of April in Herefordshire Hall, and it was a sensation. No solicitor had been prosecuted for murder before, and reporters thrilled to Armstrong's cool demeanour in court, perhaps mistaking a familiar ease with this particular courtroom for hubris and sociopathic behaviour. Public and media interest was enormous. A year earlier there had been a trial at Carmarthen Assizes of another solicitor, Harold Greenwood, for the murder of his wife by poison, supposedly disguised as an illness. Greenwood had eventually been acquitted. The fact that the 3 men who brought the charges to the police, including Armstrong's business rival and father-in-law, looked suspicious to some people, and it was believed by some that Armstrong was being framed. But despite the widespread belief that he would be acquitted, the prosecution case was a strong one. Katherine Armstrong's body was infused with arsenic, and the quantity at the time of her death must have been far higher, and her husband had made several huge purchases of the poison. The defence had to make the jury believe that Mrs. Armstrong had committed suicide by getting out of bed, going downstairs and helping herself to arsenic without anyone seeing or hearing her, or that massive doses had somehow got into her system by accident. All witnesses confirmed that towards the end she was almost paralysed and completely bedridden. Bernard Spilsbury insisted that the fatal dose must have been taken within 24 hours prior to death, and Dr. Hinks confirmed that for Mrs. Armstrong to have taken it herself was absolutely impossible. Armstrong had to explain the reason he had so much arsenic in his possession, or the white powder arsenic trioxide. He claimed that it was his practice to put small portions of arsenic into individual pouches, which he squirted into the ground near spots where dandelions tended to grow. One small pouch was found on him following his arrest, and there was no reasonable explanation offered for his carrying it around, particularly as the arrest was in December, when weeds are generally dormant. He did not come over very well under close questioning concerning this point. At the trial, two possible motives emerged for Katherine Armstrong's murder by poisoning. Firstly, Armstrong had decided he wanted a different, more congenial wife, and secondly, she had written a will in 1917, leaving the bulk of her estate not to her husband, but to their children. Armstrong had produced a different will following his wife's death, giving him control of her estate, but it was possible that it was probably forged. For some time before the Velin-Reid estate debacle, Armstrong's business had been in financial difficulties. Problems in relation to the property sale only exacerbated the cash flow problems, which made things even worse for him. The evidence against him, though considerable, was nonetheless very circumstantial. No one had seen the accused administering any poison, and Mrs. Armstrong had occasionally spoken of suicide. In those days, some medicines contained arsenic, and there were plenty of other people coming into contact with her at the family home. The prosecution failed to show how it was Armstrong, and only Armstrong, who administered poison, and no one else. As for the Martin poisoning, other than gaining Armstrong a little time, his death would not in any way have relieved his not inconsiderable business and financial problems. Armstrong made no confession and adamantly maintained his total innocence to the end. On the 13th of April at Herefordshire Hall Crown Court, he was found guilty of the murder of his wife. The judge stated that he concurred with the jury's verdict and that it was absurd and unsupported by any evidence that Mrs. Armstrong had committed suicide. He then sentenced Armstrong to death. On the 16th of May 1922, the Court of Criminal Appeal dismissed his application, and Armstrong was hung by John Ellis at Gloucester Prison on the 31st of May. The News of the World reported that when they asked the prison governor on the morning of the execution, he said that Armstrong's last words were, "I am innocent of the crime for which I have been condemned to die." The children, who are now orphaned, were brought up by an aunt. Armstrong's legal practice in Hay-on-Wye is still a solicitor's office to this day.